warm welcome to you all. I'm Sue Bernarde, a licensed Davis facilitator. I'm excited to welcome you here this evening to reveal the hidden secret of how Davis methods have been transforming lives across the globe for the last 30 plus years. Recently, a South African lady who attended a Davis program said at the end, "The grace that I have found with myself and my daughter from something so simple, so quick, is really mind-blowing what it did." Dyslexia, the label, and then what? So, some background you may all be familiar with. That of parents getting others to see and believe the ongoing learning issues and the pain they observe their children struggling with, or an individual personal experience. Generally, all roads point to getting a diagnosis to access help. During this stage, time seems to stand still. It takes years to gain a diagnosis, and we all know school years are a one-time offer and can't be repeated. After much time and expense, a diagnosis is achieved. Yay! Hope is restored now. We have a label to communicate with, including directions as to the type of support needed. However, it's soon learned that neurodivergent provision is very much a postcode lottery. It may or may not recognise how the individual learns. It's rarely individualised. Provision is fraught with issues such as those shared in the ongoing media reports, which you're all very familiar with, and the person has to fit a formalised programme studied by the specialist teacher who is providing for them. These are usually repeated early learning methods which continue to switch the individual off or result in long-term dependency. Thus, the struggle takes another turn to find out what works for the person. In answering this, I'd like to now introduce our speaker for the evening, Richard Whitehead. Richard is author of 2 books, Why Tyrannosaurus But Not If, the Dyslexic Blueprint for the Future of Education, and of the Counting on Fingers, Why Some Bright and Creative People Struggle with Numbers and Maths and How That Can Be Changed. He's a Pathos accredited dyslexia assessor and former secondary school SENCo. Richard is director and principal trainer of the Davis UK and Ireland and has delivered one-to-one Davis programs since 2002. Richard has presented on the Davis methods across 5 continents and has conducted webinars and lectures on multisensory learning for Operation Diversity at the University of Chester, the Jamila Milila Islamic University of Delhi, the University of South Africa, as well as regularly for the Davis UK and Ireland. He has been a guest speaker at the Dyslexia Show for 3 years. Richard's mission is to show how Davis methods transform lives by unlocking the neurodivergent person's learning potential, thus restoring their creativity and innovation needed for our world today. Let's give Richard a warm welcome.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm going to try to do a thing with the microphone before we move on. How is this? Loud and clear? Wonderful. Great. If it starts to crackle against my clothing or anything like that, then, well, let me know or we'll know about it and switch back. But otherwise, it can be around a bit more. Once again, lovely to be here with you all this evening. I think I want to ask, following on from Sue's very moving words just now, the title of this webinar, or of this lecture, rather, Dyslexia, the label, and then what? Does that resonate? I suppose it's a silly question, because if it didn't, you wouldn't be here. But does that resonate as a title? So something that is said to us time and time again by families visiting our Davis facilitator practices. And it's also something that I'm acutely aware of, as Sue mentioned earlier. As well as being a Davis facilitator, I'm a diagnostic assessor. So I do diagnostic assessments, and I'm very aware of my responsibility in providing a report to somebody who I will probably never see again, in all likelihood, and how far that report is then going to impact and reach into a person's life. And what we are aware of is that very often the diagnosis or the label can feel like an achievement, and it is often the culmination of years of effort, right, of trying to get this label, trying to get this assessment, trying to get confirmation from society. Yes, my child has needs, special needs that need to be looked after. But at the same time, it can be a cliff edge. So you receive the report or the diagnosis, and then suddenly there's the realization that actually not much has changed. As Sue was saying, the educational structures that we have still don't really have the answers that my child needs. So this talk essentially aims to address this quandary and fill in that gap, and to provide some simple, workable remedies and ways forward. So Sue's already spoken about me. The one thing Sue didn't mention is that for my sins, I'm a linguist originally, but I work across the kind of the neurodivergent spectrum with the Davis methods. What I'm interested in now is just maybe finding out a little bit about you. So it's lovely to have you all here. By the way, when we approached Sheffield Students' Union, we kind of asked for a nice cozy little room that we could use for this talk, and we were given this, with thanks to the marvellous Marianne up at the top, because this was the room that happened to be free. So we thought, well, we'll spread out and enjoy ourselves. So I would love to find out just a little bit more about you. Feel free to remain in anonymity if you want to, but if you feel like, we're curious to know, for example, first of all, who is here with a family interest in dyslexia? That there's a member of the family, perhaps, who has dyslexic needs. That's great. Okay. And who is here with a kind of a professional or educational interest? You teach, or you tutor, or yeah. Okay. And who's here perhaps with a personal interest? And who's here with an interest I haven't mentioned? Okay. Perfect. Great. That's really useful. Thanks. So a word about us now. We are Davis UK and Ireland, and Davis UK and Ireland is part of the worldwide Davis network of expert neurodiversity practitioners, known as facilitators, who provide high-impact, fast-track interventions for children and adults, ranging from dyslexia through to ADHD, dyspraxia, maths difficulties, and autism. We also provide parent courses, workshops, and a range of other solutions. There are a little over 30 of us facilitators spread around the UK, including Sue, who just spoke earlier on your doorstep in Sheffield. Davis UK and Ireland itself is a non-profit organisation. I'm going to be saying a little bit more about all of that later on. So here's what we're going to do this evening. We're going to start by looking at the mainstream view of dyslexia. Okay, the traditional mainstream view of dyslexia, which will be the view or the definition of dyslexia that determines the diagnostic assessments. It's on the basis of this that the label dyslexia, if you like, is given or not given. And I was looking recently at the British Dyslexia Association definition and discovered something rather interesting. Until quite recently, the definition, I think last time I checked, it referred to a lifelong learning difficulty. Now it refers to a learning difference. And that little change of word represents quite a substantial shift in how dyslexia is coming to be viewed, which we're going to be saying more about in the course of this evening. So the British Dyslexia Association now just defines dyslexia as a learning difference which primarily affects reading and writing skills. However, it does not only affect these skills. Dyslexia is actually about information processing. Dyslexic people may have difficulty processing and remembering information they see and hear, which can affect learning and the acquisition of literacy skills. Dyslexia can also impact on other areas such as organizational skills. Now, it's interesting, as I said, the word difference is used here. We still have a definition which is focusing first and foremost on the challenge aspects of dyslexia. So it's focusing pretty much exclusively on what dyslexics find difficult. And that's significant. We're going to be saying more about that in a little bit later on. Okay. Another definition, I won't go through all of it, but a new definition was published by something called the Delphi Group, the Delphi study last year, which again defined dyslexia as primarily a set of processing difficulties involving difficulties in reading and spelling fluency. Again, that it can impact other skills, mathematics, reading comprehension, learning another language can be impacted. Then dyslexia is a difficulty in phonological processing. We're going to be saying a little bit more about that in due course. Working memory, we're also going to be talking about that. Orthographic skills, that's just a really fancy way of saying spelling, by the way, okay? And processing speed problems. Okay, so what we have here is a couple of definitions using, I suppose, relatively technical language in order to define what dyslexia is, that we as kind of lay people then need to be able to unpick and figure out what it all means. And we're going to be doing that in a moment. I'm going to be, in a moment, working through some of the key terms that you will see if you or your child or your student or pupil receives some form of formal dyslexia diagnosis or label. The technical terms that will feature, and we're going to be then converting those into something perhaps that's simpler to understand and that infuses them with a bit more meaning for you. And then we're going to be going on and turning the page and looking at the strengths side of dyslexia. Okay, so in fact, if we look at the strengths side, Ron Davis, the creator of our methods, published a book in 1994 called The Gift of Dyslexia. That was Ron Davis's first book, just 30 years ago. And when he published the book in the 90s, he encountered resistance and astonishment at the idea that dyslexia could possibly stem from a perceptual talent, which is Ron's approach. Because the existing framework for understanding dyslexia, as we've seen from the mainstream definition still that we just looked at, it was firmly rooted in the idea that dyslexia is a difficulty, it's a disability, what we might call a deficit model of dyslexia. And some people even took offense, thinking that the very real pain of a dyslexic learning difficulty was being airbrushed away by the claim that dyslexia was a gift. In reality, anyone familiar with Ron's own history, which included beatings, bullying attacks, and being left in a corner for hours on end at school in the 1940s and 50s, would see that this was far from Ron's intention. And nowadays, a quick search on Google, Pinterest, or YouTube shows that celebration of dyslexic talent abounds. You can find it everywhere. Jamie Oliver is now, a great and a very powerful advocate for this. Yeah. So the idea of dyslexic giftedness, we could say, it perhaps has finally become mainstream. However, the mainstream recognition of dyslexic talent frequently still misses a trick. So often it's like famous dyslexics are held up as a kind of a comfort blanket for the dyslexic child who's struggling at school. So it's like, okay, you find it difficult to read and write, but don't worry, so did Tom Cruise. Yeah, okay. And famous dyslexics are typically showcased as people who've succeeded in spite of their dyslexia. Whereas in Davis, we see these individuals as having succeeded because of their dyslexia. Okay, so in Davis, we see dyslexia as the primary thinking tool, if you like, the intellectual capital of the dyslexic individual. We're going to be saying more about this shortly. And this understanding opens up a whole new way of helping dyslexic individuals to learn. Okay. So it's time to start considering dyslexic difficulties and dyslexic talent together as two sides of the same coin. And it's in understanding the interplay between these two sides, the difficulties and the talents, as stemming from the same dyslexic identity. Yeah. It's understanding that interplay that makes us intelligent about what dyslexia actually is and how dyslexic learners can claim their right for their learning to be easy. Yes, easy and successful. Okay. Now, it isn't just us at Davis who are saying this. So neurologist Dr. Fernette Eide, co-author of The Dyslexic Advantage, a fabulous book that came out about getting on for 15 years ago now, about dyslexic talent. And co-founder of the charity by the same name, she puts it thus. So Dr. Eide says, it's a huge mistake to regard a dyslexic child as if his or her brain is trying to follow the same pathway of development as all the other kids, but is simply doing a bad job of it. In reality, the brains of kids with dyslexic processing styles are actually developing in a very different way. They establish a different pattern of connections and circuitry, creating a different kind of problem-solving apparatus. The difference is global, not just in certain areas of the brain. Simply put, dyslexia is not a deficit. It is a style of thinking in its own right, with its own pattern of challenges and strengths. Okay, I've put a QR code up there, by the way. There's going to be a few of these in the course of the lecture. If any of you feel like code zapping, that one takes you to the full article from which this is taken by Dr. Eide. And we haven't got time to go into it here, but it's extremely interesting. She looks at 4 different types of logic and reasoning that dyslexics excel in, often by comparison with non-dyslexics. So if you're interested in digging further, do take a little zap of that. Okay. Here's a real life example of dyslexic thinking, intelligent dyslexic thinking. So one of the elements of a Davis Mastery for Dyslexia program that we're going to be talking about later is a process of making creative models in white plasticine clay, showing the meanings of the common abstract words of language. Words like if, as, but, when, and so on. Okay, this enhances fluency of reading. Now here's a model made by a boy called Charlie, who was 7 when he made the model. And the word that he's expressing the meaning of is the word now. The definition of now that he used from the Children's Dictionary was in the present moment. So Charlie thought, what am I doing now in the present moment? Well, I'm making a model of now. So he made a model of himself, making the word now. Yeah, aged 7. And this is a great example of the heightened pictorial logic that even quite young dyslexic children can sometimes exhibit. Kind of cool. And again, the QR code here takes you to a website with more of these photos if any of you are interested in that. Right, so let's start by examining the difficulties that accompany dyslexia, okay, and the indicators that are going to be in a typical specialist teacher or educational psychologist assessment. Okay, so they have been researched and described in the diagnostic assessment in line with the traditional mainstream definitions. So the kind of the key diagnostics would be, first of all, lack of age-appropriate reading fluency. Okay, so reading is hard and it's not happening in the way that it should. Poor spelling for a person's age. And then there's some additional areas to do with sort of processing of information that we're going to be unpicking a little bit together. Low phonological awareness, working memory restrictions, and processing speed restrictions. Okay, so let's look at those 3. Starting with phonological awareness. How many of you come across that term, phonological awareness, in the wider context? So phonological is basically, phonological means sounds or words, okay? And phonological awareness, it's a person's ability to think with the sounds of letters, groups of letters, and words. Most children become fluent in this ability early in their primary school education, but a significant minority of any population experiences difficulty with this mental function and will be said to have a phonological deficit. or it's sometimes called low phonological awareness. Okay, so this is thinking with the sounds that make up words, like actor as making up cat. Yeah. So the ability to recognize rhymes is an example of that. Okay, but also to the ability to say what is the second sound in the word frog, and to answer that it's r. Okay. Working memory is a concept that was coined by British psychologist Alan Baddeley in the 1970s. You can look him up on YouTube. He's one of the most fantastic elderly academic YouTube vloggers that you come across. He was sort of on YouTube in the 2010s, in his 70s, producing these, these videos about working memory. Now, working memory is what's called a construct. There isn't like a bit of the brain that, okay, this is the working memory bit. You can, that you can identify. Okay, there isn't a physical place where working memory resides. It's more like a model, an idea, but it's a useful model for describing and measuring a person's ability to hold a quantity of information in their short-term memory, a bit like a computer's RAM, if any of you know about computers and what that means. Okay, so holding information in the short-term memory and doing something with it. Okay, so solving a riddle in your mind, or remembering a verification code long enough to type it into a website, or remembering the 5 things your opposite number asked you to buy in the shop on the way home. By the way, if you can't do that, there's 2 possibilities. Either you have working memory restrictions or you're a man. Okay. Or remembering where you parked your car in the multi-story. Yeah, all of these are functions of working memory. Stuff that we need to hold in our memory for a little while and then chuck when we don't need it anymore. Okay. And working memory has a phonological, a sound-based component, a bit like having a little MP3 record and playback device in the mind. Okay. So somebody can say a string of digits to you and you say them back like an echo. Okay. And there's another element that's called the visual spatial sketchpad. And that's probably how you find your car in the multi-story or in the flat car park, remembering where you parked it. Okay. And in a diagnostic assessment, it's normally measured, working memory is normally measured by asking a person to repeat strings of digits and or letters forwards, and then repeating similar strings backwards. And some testing models include non-verbal elements of working memory, such as remembering kind of sequences of hand gestures and repeating those. So far, so good. Yeah. Okay. And then there's processing speed. Processing speed is a measure of a person's ability to perform a series of tasks rapidly, ranging across visual symbol puzzles like the ones you see on the screen, and naming letters or numbers as fast as possible, which is sometimes called verbal processing speed or rapid automatized naming. Okay, so that's the kind of the principle here, but those indicators don't really tell us what's going on underneath. So let's now scratch the surface. So typically a diagnostic assessment report will comment on any deficits in those above categories, along with the level of performance in various types of reading or writing. And that's as far as it goes, because if you have a deficit model for dyslexia, all you're looking to do is saying, this person can't do this, 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 this. What a shame. This is the support they need. Okay. But what we need to do, as I say, is to scratch the surface and determine what underlying elements of a person's thinking style are causing these restrictions. So let's start with phonological awareness. Once again, phonological awareness is the ability to think with the sounds of letters, groups of letters, and words. Okay. Now, in the Davis model of dyslexia, we have a very different starting point for psychometric testing, namely the lived experience of Ronald Davis on the poster over here. Okay. And Ron, who's now 82, was functionally illiterate until the age of 38, despite having been diagnosed at the age of 17 as having a genius IQ. At the age of 38, Davis then had a personal breakthrough, which enabled him to learn to read at university level within a matter of months. Through the 1980s, Davis worked with hundreds of individuals and was able to document the various ways in which dyslexic thought differs from non-dyslexic thought. And one of Davis's first discoveries was that humans have 2 fundamentally different ways in which they can think. One of those in Davis, is that visible on the slide? Yeah. We call word thinking or verbal thinking. Word thinking is essentially, it's like listening to your to words in your head. Internal monologue, a voice in their head, if you like. It's almost like, talking without moving your mouth. If you do word thinking, and not everybody does, I'm going to do a little straw poll in a moment, but if you do, you might do it in situations where, for example, you're on the way to a milestone birthday party for an elderly relative, and you've been asked to give a little speech, celebrating their life and saying what a wonderful person they are. And on the way, you might be kind of scrolling through like a verbal script in your mind and kind of rehearsing it like words in the mind. Okay. But there are some people who don't do word thinking. Out of interest, can you do a quick show of hands? How many of you relate to the idea of word thinking with the sounds of words in your mind? How many of you don't? And are sitting thinking, what on earth is this he's talking about? Okay, perfect, great. You are a fairly representative audience, by the way, in this. So then the other type of thinking that we identify in Davis is picture thinking or non-verbal thinking. That's thinking with mental pictures, concepts, ideas directly. Okay. If somebody asks you the way to somewhere and you say, right, you need to go down to the end of the road, you'll get to a roundabout, you take the third exit, you'll pass the supermarket on the left, you'll go over a humpback bridge and so on. As you're saying those directions, you're probably experiencing in pictures where you're sending that person. At least I hope you are. Yeah. Does that make sense? And most of us can relate to picture thinking on some level. With some of us, it's more visual, consciously visual. With some of us, it's a bit more phantom-like. With some of us, it's a bit more tactile. Getting the feeling, imagining what it would feel like to be stroking a cat, for example. Yeah. If you're a good cook, you might be able to imagine what your soup would taste like with a bit more salt and garlic, and so on. And so all of this, it's like mental imagery in our imagination. Okay, and thinking directly with that mental imagery. Does that idea make some sense to everybody? Anybody for whom it doesn't? Because we can go, oh yeah, I understand. But yeah, you don't. Yeah, but you get what we mean by it. Perfect. Okay. Now, what we found in Davis is that dyslexics specialize in picture thinking. Okay. Ron Davis himself can hold an audience spellbound for 3 hours without a PowerPoint. He's extremely verbally fluent, clear, and articulate, but he does not think with the sounds of words. He speaks directly from his pictures. And dyslexic individuals will tend not to be doing word thinking. They'll be tending to specialize in picture thinking, including this lady, atypical Erin.
Today's episode of How Were You Not Diagnosed Sooner? Do you have an inner monologue? I do not. I always thought I did, but it turns out I actually think in pictures, whereas most people think in words or have an inner narration. It does not exist for me. The best way I can explain this is that when I would study for tests when I was in school and I was taking the test, I would not recall the information. Instead, I would recall the image of the page that I had studied, and I would try in my mind's eye to find the answer to that question on the page. Almost like a photographic memory. The same is true with like intrusive thoughts. I'm not thinking an intrusive thought. I'm actually visualizing the intrusive thought, which makes it that much more awful. Do you think in pictures? Do you think in words? Tell me about it.
Okay. So
today's episode.
Great. Can we see how that maps onto phonological awareness? Yeah. If you're being tested and you're being asked questions like, the word train has 4 sounds, what's the second sound? And you don't do word thinking, and you're a child, that's going to be difficult, right? If you specialize in picture thinking, you're going to test almost certainly as having poor phonological awareness. You're also not going to be responding very well to traditional phonic-based reading instruction, which also assumes word thinking ability / phonological awareness in order to work. Yeah, and we'll say a little bit more about this later on. Okay. But what we have here is a kind of a way of seeing what's below the surface of these diagnostic criteria. It's telling us something about the way a person thinks and the way a person doesn't think. So far, so good? Yeah. So, in fact, let's look a little bit closer at that. Yeah. So what we're looking at here is a thinking difference between dyslexic individuals and non-dyslexic individuals. And if dyslexics think differently from non-dyslexics, then they're almost certainly going to learn differently from non-dyslexics. And one of the first things they're going to learn or try to learn in school is reading. And for a dyslexic, that's going to be different too. Now, a key principle of the Davis approach is the truism that every word consists of 3 parts. Because every word can be written down, so it has a visual appearance on the page as a sequence of letters, like the word Tyrannosaurus, beginning T, Y, R, A, and so on. Okay? Every word can also be spoken, so it has a sound. And every word has a meaning, because we don't insert random nonsense into our speech or writing for no reason. So the meaning of each word is, if you'd like, it's its function in our communication. Does that work okay for everyone? Yeah, we all have every word. Every word has 3 parts. No word has 2 parts. No word has 4 parts. No word has 267 parts, and so on. Every word has these 3 parts, and only these 3. So what that means is when you're reading, you open the book, and on the page is what's bottom left. It's what the word looks like. All right? And because a word has 3 parts, you have a couple of options as to what could happen next. So let's say you are a non-dyslexic child who's been responding quite well or very well to the traditional mainstream phonic-based instruction. And the phonic-based instruction has been centering around linking letters to sounds. You'll be taught that A says A, yeah, T says T, and so on. Then these get blended, okay? And then you move on to syllables and then on to whole words. And it's all about decoding words. It's about seeing the word on the page and getting from bottom left to bottom right to the sound of the word from the spelling. So you see C-A-T and you go cat. Yeah. And if you're a word-thinking child who's not dyslexic, that'll work rather well for you. But once you've got to the sound, even if it's the voice in the head, the word-thinking voice in the head, if you're reading silently, if you're a native speaker or a good speaker of the language you're reading, you'll be able to get from the sound to the meaning, and you'll be able to understand what you're meaning. But you went that way about it. Okay. Now, however, what if you're dyslexic or potentially dyslexic? What if you're a natural picture thinker with a lively, curious imagination, okay, inquisitive, explorative, and you see a word like that on the page? Where are you going to go? Are you going to go A, to a little voice in the head that goes, Tyrannosaurus? Or B, are you going to go to a picture of, okay? You're much more likely to be going that way. Yeah? So the dyslexic child, even though this isn't obviously visible, is going from the word on the page direct to its meaning, to the mental imagery around the meaning, because that's what a picture thinker does, naturally and intentionally. Okay? And again, if you're a good speaker or a native speaker of the language that you know, and you've seen the word on the page and then you've gone to you'll be able to say Tyrannosaurus if you're being asked to read out loud. So it will look like on that word you've done the phonics, whereas actually you went the other way. Does that make sense? And interestingly, we've known this for decades from clinical observation, but more recently in the I'm going to QR code for this one. I can give the link for this one later if anyone's interested. But a couple of neuroscanning research projects looked at brain imaging in order to look at the sequence in which the brain is activated in dyslexic subjects compared with non-dyslexic subjects. And what you see up here is that these studies discovered that the parts of the brain responsible for meaning and categorization were activated much more quickly in the dyslexic subjects compared to those responsible for phonology, in other words, sounds of words, and orthography, spelling. Whereas in the non-dyslexic subjects, it went the other way. The phonological ones were activated first, and then the ones to do with meaning afterwards. So you have here kind of a direct corroboration of what we kind of already knew. Now, how did we know that? Because of what happens on the little words. So when a dyslexic reader comes across a word like if, now you get why my first book was called Why Tyrannosaurus, but not if. Well, what picture do you get for if? None in particular, right? It's a blank. Yeah. So if I'm reading the word if, I can't make a mental picture for what that means. I get a blank picture. And the feeling that attaches itself to a blank picture is a feeling of confusion. And if it's blank, how on earth do I get down to what's underneath? Okay, to the sound. So when I'm reading out loud, I might well sound a little bit like this. Okay, I can't play this to you. That's a real shame. But this was a reading error analysis that I did as a diagnostic assessor with a 14-year-old dyslexic boy. And if you were hearing this, what you would hear was, if you look at all the words that have been underlined, many of those words are the small common abstract words. And he's stumbling. He says things like his name was Toby, and he was quite small and short dark hair, and a habit, he just misses out had a habit of staying open-mouthed and things occasionally. And he's reading words like occasionally, listening, settling, popular, weekends, perfectly fluently. But it's the little words that are tripping him up again and again. And if you have the opportunity, if you have a family member who's dyslexic and they read out loud for you, listen out for the pattern that's going on and see if you notice a pattern of tripping up on the small abstract common words. If you're dyslexic yourself, trying sound recording yourself and then playing it back and seeing if that's what's happening. Okay, it almost invariably will be those words that are the key triggers, if you like, that are tripping you up and depriving you of reading fluency. So in all areas of learning, and in learning to read not least, dyslexics will thrive when learning actively by doing. And they will respond less well to passive learning methods, such as listening to oral spoken explanations, or what's sometimes called chalk and talk, and to just memorization, rote learning. And we'll have more on this later. Now let's look at working memory. Was another criterion, right, from the diagnostic assessments. So once again, working memory is kind of like your biological RAM. It's your ability to hold a quantity of information in your short-term memory and do something with it. Now, when I wrote my first book, I had in mind something I'd noticed when conducting diagnostic assessments as a PATOS assessor. So I noticed really wide discrepancies between the scores that the same individual would often achieve across different working memory subtests. So when writing write around the source but not if, I decided to put these together in a table. And what we had, this was a working memory test with 5 subtests. The first one was digit recall forwards. So I would say 8, 6, and you had to repeat 8, 6. And then I give you 5, 9, 3. You say 5, 9, 3. And then I give you a longer string and an even longer string that we keep going until you can't do it anymore. And that provides the score. Then we have the same thing in the second subtest for letters. I say a string of letters, you repeat them forwards. Then we have manual imitation, which is hand gestures, sequences of hand gestures. Then digit recall backwards. So I say 1, 2, 3, you say 3, 2, 1, and so on. And then letter recall backwards. So those are the 5 subtests. And the scores are cited as so-called scale scores. So in this system, 10 is the mean. 10 is where you're kind of expected to be if you're Mr. Average, Mrs. Average. Okay. 7 is the lower boundary of the average range. And 13 is the upper boundary of the average range. Okay. And I've sort of shade coded the different ranges of scores. And it gives us a striking story. So one of the people up here, AY and CE, they are atrocious at recalling digits forwards, but they emerge as absolute dupes when doing the same thing with letters. Okay. EB shows a similar pattern, but in reverse. RC grapples in vain with mathematical digits, but when repeating hand gestures in the manual imitation subtest, he proves quite the whiz with his anatomical ones. Okay. Only DR, LM, and VK remain stoically monochrome across all 5 subtests. So what we're seeing is these really big discrepancies where somebody can be, in one subtest, it's like you've got a real problem here. In another one, wow, you're amazing here. It's the same person, just looking at different subtests within working memory. So what's going on here? Well, a key reason for these inconsistencies is likely to be found in a creative mental function that in Davis we call disorientation. Dyslexics tend to be very good at this function, and we're going to be going into this in more depth and detail shortly. As a general principle, working memory restrictions can be bypassed through active experiential learning. Working memory is not the same as doing memory. Many individuals with working memory challenges have an excellent memory for key life experiences. And the challenge to us educators, therefore, is to create learning environments that enable key learning elements to become memorable as opposed to memorized. Here's an example recorded by my colleague Anri Lawrence in South Africa. Anri is in training as a facilitator, to be a facilitator at the moment, and she was trying out the Davis approach to mastering the alphabet. And this learner creates the alphabet in clay themselves. This is followed by a process of intentional visualization, which ends in the person being able to say the alphabet forwards and backwards with their eyes closed. This expert, recorded in Afrikaans, shows this learner kind of in the final stages near the end of this process.
Is in hier nur in da in a hier hier
Okay, so sound quality isn't brilliant, and it's in Afrikaans, but you can see what he was doing with his eyes closed and looking up. He's reciting the alphabet backwards, not from some kind of rote learned process, but from a visual imprint, if you like, mental images that he's built up through the active learning process with the alphabet that he's created. Okay, and that does not look like somebody who would be diagnosed with working memory restrictions, right? Although he probably would be, in a traditional formal test. So put another way, people with working memory challenges need active rather than passive learning environments. And an active learning environment is one where the learners create their own materials for learning. Here's an example taken from the Davis Learning Strategies project, which is a primary classroom, whole class teaching project. It's kind of a whole class version, if you like, of what you saw on the previous slide. You can see all the children there with their little boxes full of their plasticine letters that they made, using their focusing tools, which are another part of the Davis approach, in order to master and assimilate those letters, what they look like, what their names are, and what their order is when they're in the alphabet. Now let's start processing speed. Now notice the linear nature of the test on the screen. In my experience, all processing speed tests are tests of linear processing speed, doing one thing after another after another. Well, perhaps they were designed by linear thinkers. Dyslexics and other neurodivergents, by contrast, tend to get from A to B via non-linear routes that can include multitasking, lateral thinking, visualization, and sometimes distraction. Here is ADHD blogger Ryan Niger describing his thought process. While his focus is on ADHD, much of what he says here can be carried across to dyslexia too.
2, go! You meet someone new and then 5 seconds after they've introduced themselves, you already forgot their name. No matter how hard you try to focus, whenever you're reading something like a book or a textbook, read every single word on the page, you hear every single word in your head, yet 5 pages down the road, you have no idea what's going on or how you got there. You look at someone straight in the eyes, and rather than paying attention to what they're saying, you're trying to decide which eye you normally look at. Is it the left eye or the right eye? Or maybe it's the nose or the mouth. Or maybe you're supposed to look at the face as a whole, but you already forgot how to do that because now all you see is a bunch of face parts. To you, there's no such thing as sitting still. You don't realize it until someone tells you to stop, but you've either been rapidly shaking your leg, tapping your hands, or nodding your head to music that isn't there, or playing with whatever is currently in your hands, like a cell phone. You're a time traveler. You go and take a 5-minute Facebook break from work, and when you come back, it's an hour later. Sometimes you have to remind yourself to smile when you're with people, not because you don't like them or because you're upset. It's because you have a bunch of other thoughts going through your head that aren't smile worthy. No matter how hard you try or how important the call is, when you're on the phone with someone, you have to be doing something else at the same time. You don't intentionally procrastinate. You're just most productive when you have to get something done. You work best when you're under pressure. Again.
Okay, you get the idea. Can you relate to that? Yeah, perfect. Okay, so somebody like that is likely to be tested with slow processing speed. Yeah, he doesn't come across as very slow, does he? But if you give someone like that a linear test, and his thought process is doing what he just described, he's going to have had 100 other random thoughts, or associated thoughts between each item that he's trying to solve on the test. So he's going to come out the other end with a slow processing speed, and he's probably going to get extra time in exams, which he may or may not need. But essentially, again, we're sort of scratching the surface in order to see what goes beyond this deficit-based diagnosis of a processing speed problem. Okay. So when supporting the learning of dyslexic individuals, seeing dyslexia as a sophisticated interplay between difficulty and talent opens up a new mindset. If we see dyslexia as a disability, as a deficit, then our role as a parent or as an educator is solely to provide coping strategies, crutches, and props, right? We see our role as doing for the dyslexic person what they can't do for themselves, and what we assume they will never be able to do, or as showing them tricks so that they can get around what we assume to be a lifelong learning disability. We become the person supplying answers for a person who can't find them for themselves. But when we see dyslexia as a thinking style in its own right, with a talent side alongside the difficulties, this changes our approach fundamentally. Recognizing a dyslexic individual as differently able, with their own perceptual talents, starts to make us curious about how the individual thinks and how the individual learns. We start to see ourselves not as a teacher or advice giver, but as a facilitator of the individual's learning. We start to recognize that the answers to the individual's learning difficulties lie not in us, but in the individual themselves. And we start to see that our job isn't to be the person with the right answers, it's to be the person with the right questions. So be warned, here comes some slightly technical stuff, okay? To understand the gift of dyslexia, we need to understand three puzzle pieces that are present both in the talent aspect and in the difficulty aspect of dyslexia. Davis identifies these three puzzle pieces as strong non-verbal conceptualization, in other words, picture thinking, which we've looked at already, being expert at disorientation, and having a mind that responds quickly and creatively to confusion, what we call a low threshold for confusion. And we've already looked at picture thinking. Let's look at the other two elements now in a bit more detail. So, on top of being picture thinkers, dyslexics, as I said earlier, tend to be experts at using a creative mental function, which we call disorientation. Disorientation is your mind's ability to experience its imagination as if it were reality. So, for example, have any of you ever sat in a stationary vehicle like a train? Yeah? And you're looking out of the window and an adjacent vehicle, the train on the next platform, for example, starts moving. Yeah? What do you feel? You feel like you're moving. Yeah? And it's not like you're in make-believe land as if you're moving. You really, really feel, your body feels like it's moving, right? I've been in situations where I've been pumping the brakes in my stationary car because the van was moving backwards, and I thought I was moving forwards. Yeah, okay. So your mind in that moment can't tell the difference between its imagination and external reality. Now, optical illusions can also produce this effect. As you look at this slide, does it appear to be moving? Might depend on where you're sitting in the room. Yeah, okay. So it isn't. It's not an animated GIF. It's a static picture. And it's actually your mind that is generating the experience of movement when actually there is none. So you are experiencing disorientation. Do any of you feel apologies if you do slightly dizzy or sick from it? I'll take it off in a moment. Okay, which is also a sign of disorientation. And just as you experience disorientation here, so the dyslexic child who complains that the letters move around the page, or who is seeing saw when the word is experiencing disorientation in the reading process. Okay, so while the perceptual distortion produced by disorientation can cause you problems, disorientation can also be a creative problem-solving talent. When you're not getting an answer from what your eyes are seeing, you may need to twist, turn, or otherwise change what you're seeing until it makes sense. And dyslexics tend to be very good at this creative disorientation function and automatically deploy it whenever they experience confusion and or where distortion or mental rotation would give you, a new perspective or a new answer. So I sometimes say that the same mode of thinking that will create a successful architect as an adult who can helicopter, as it were, around a building they're creating in their imagination, will create a 5-year-old child who's picturing a B as a D. It's essentially the same mental function. Okay, and as a result, dyslexics learn to disorientate very quickly and readily in response to the feeling of confusion, because as little children, they get a lot of answers and solutions from doing so. So this is something that we call a low threshold for confusion. As an asset, it can make a dyslexic individual get to an answer, and often the right one at intuitive speed. As a liability, it can prevent a dyslexic individual from staying mentally present when confronted with information that doesn't immediately make or fully make sense. So what happens to our bright, picture-thinking, confusion-sensitive expert in disorientation to turn a perceptual talent into a learning difficulty? Well, a poignant sequence of events has to take place that Ron Davis calls the anatomy of a learning disability. So first, the individual has to encounter an unrecognized stimulus. This could be a letter, a mathematical symbol, a word, written or spoken, a concept that the person doesn't understand, or an object that's not recognized. And the lack of recognition causes a feeling of confusion. I don't get what this is. I want to get what it is, but I don't get what it is. I'm confused. And the confusion, because I have a low threshold for confusion, it naturally and automatically triggers disorientation, which in turn produces false sensory perceptions. So just like sitting in the train, I'm experiencing as if I'm moving when I'm not. So now I'm charged in a classroom, I'm experiencing S as if it were backwards when it's not. Yeah, you might have had the same experience if you were over at a social function when somebody introduces themselves as Mark, and then you'll spend the rest of the evening thinking, did he say Mark or did he say John? And then you kind of, wait for someone else to say his name so that you don't show yourself up by saying the wrong name. Yeah. So again, most likely you had a momentary disorientation when you were being introduced to the person, and you made an alternate thought picture for what the name was that you processed as if that was reality alongside the other one. And then you're going, was it this or was it that? Was it this or was it that? Yeah. Same with the child in the classroom. Was S this or was it that? I was disorientated when I was looking at it, so I made a picture for both and processed both of them as if they were real. Okay. So the individual essentially is using disorientation to mentally examine the stimulus in order to try to recognize it, to give it meaning, and to resolve the confusion using the creative part of their mind. Yeah. But the different views and perceptions that the individual is examining mentally are being registered in the brain as if they were actual perceptions, because that's what disorientation is. So that means then the information potentially is going to be assimilated incorrectly. And then when the person has to reproduce the information, they do something that we call a mistake. Yeah. What they're doing is they're putting down now on paper what their disorientation recorded as being the thing at the time. Does that make sense? Yeah. It's like you say John to the person and say, hang on, I'm Mark. Yeah. Okay. Now, over time, these mistakes will give rise to an emotional reaction, not necessarily immediately. But imagine being in a classroom for days, weeks, months, years. Some of you have probably walked this walk, yeah? As a bright individual, but experiencing yourself as if you were stupid. Because again and again and again, you find yourself unable to do something that, as far as you can tell, all the other children are doing fine. Yeah, and that's happening again and again and again. Yep. And sooner or later, this is going to give rise to an emotional reaction that we call frustration. Okay? It's the result of the cumulative effects of the mistakes and the emotional baggage that is accumulated from them. Okay? At that point, the person is going to be ready to assimilate something that in Davis we call compulsive solutions. So these are kind of tricks, if you like, that then give the impression that I've exited the confusion and the problem. So let's say somebody says to a child, hey, I notice you're getting your S back to front. If you draw a face and you write the word smile on a smile, if you get the S the right way round, then the smile is going to be right. And then the person goes, ah, okay. And now suddenly progress. The next school report says, Johnny or Frida has stopped reversing in their letters. Yeah. The S is now consistently the right way around. Wonderful. Lots of smiling faces. However, the individual just took on a piece of kind of mental baggage, because every time that person writes an S, they're going to have to, at some sort of speed, picture a face with a smile with an S on it. So the person hasn't mastered the S, they've mastered the face and the smile, and the face and the smile gives them the S. Okay? And so what you then have is, as these accumulate, these compulsive solutions, this kind of web of sort of tricks and baggage, if you like, that the person's knowledge is going to be built on unstable foundations. Compulsive solutions are a behavior that has worked at least once, becoming the only way to do something. Okay? What happens is now that the confusion triggers the compulsive solution and learning stops. Learning stops because the compulsive solution blocks alternative experiences. For example, well, just a couple of examples, that that finger trick for the 9 times table. Anyone know that? Where you can kind of go 9, 18, 27. Yeah. And now, oh, now I know my 9 times table. That's great. But what about divisions involving 9? That's not going to work. Yeah. So I can do 9 times 3 is 27, but 27 divided by 3. Okay, that's probably not going to work. Okay. So I can only go one way about it. Or I learned the alphabet using the alphabet song, and I still use the alphabet song. So how's it going to be when I need to use a dictionary and look up a word? Yeah, I can't go backwards to the alphabet or jump around. I can only go from A each time. So dictionary becomes something like torture. Yeah. And so what we get is a series of approaches to learning that I assimilate, but make my learning rigid. Okay. And not agile. So I can always only go one way about something, and using an awful lot of processing capacity in order to calculate things that other people are finding simple, because I've gone about it through these kind of tricks. Okay. And so what Ron Davis says is that the disability or difficulty aspect of dyslexia is actually all of the compulsive solutions that I've assimilated. Now, by contrast, when dyslexia is able to manifest as a gift, the opposite occurs. Davis sees the gift of dyslexia as the gift of mastery. What Davis said is that when someone masters something, it becomes a part of that person. It becomes part of the individual's thought and creative process. It adds the quality of its essence to all subsequent thought and creativity of the individual. And mastery is essentially its high quality experiential learning that does not rely on rote learning, drill, or repetition. Okay. And here's just a few examples of individuals talking about their Davis or their Charles Davis experience.
If your child's been having phonics for 2 years and they're still not reading and they're struggling, then it's time to try a different approach.
I was diagnosed dyslexic when I was younger. I did phonics.
Does this sound
I
okay?
couldn't read it. And I did more phonics. Still couldn't read. And then when I was 15, I did Davis. And I read my first book from cover to cover last summer after I did my Davis dyslexia program. And it was a revelation.
I came to Davis because of my 2 sons who were struggling at school.
I started because my son was diagnosed with dyslexia when he was about 7. I have a son who's dyslexic, dyspraxic, autistic, and dyscalculic. Davis isn't just help with reading or the maths. Davis is a way of learning that will take them through to university and beyond. And it will absolutely change their life.
Because they were not achieving, phonic-wise, they were being moved down the sets. Came across the book Gift of Dyslexia. I implemented much of the book. It worked. It helped my children to focus better. They've achieved really, really well. Both are highly academic people and at the top of their fields at the moment.
I advised my professionals to do phonics training. And I didn't know if there were any other options. So 2 years, I drilled him in phonics, and I'm laughing. They were dark years in our family. We were told at the time that he was damaged goods, that we should put him into a special school. We did none of that. Then I discovered Davis, just like by chance, and it was like a light bulb moment. So we stopped all the medium, and I trained in order to give my son the Davis program. And he got her first degree from Oxford University in engineering. And a lot of that is due to the change that we turned around when we did Davis stuff.
My son was diagnosed with dyslexia when he was 8 years old. He'd been completely Montessori educated from me too. So I knew he had a really good phonic instruction, but he was just stuck. So I did a massive amount of research, and then I decided just to go with the Davis first. And it had such a big, massive impact. We did the program in October. By the summer, he was then reading age appropriate books.
Does Davis mastery of dyslexia turn the dyslexic learning experience around? Well, In a Davis program, after a unique guided process that teaches an individual how to turn off their disorientations at will, using a mental tool, the individual makes all of the letters of the alphabet in clay, and then uses that orientation tool to identify any letters that their mind didn't comfortably assimilate while originally learning to read. And these letters will provoke disorientation in an individual and are known as triggers. The person's guided to eliminate the triggers, and then once none of the letters are provoking disorientation, the individual will be able to name the letters forwards and backwards with their eyes closed, as you saw in the earlier video, from a clear mental image. This in turn forms a basis for building spelling skills through visualization. Reading itself is then built up through a series of targeted non-phonic exercises that enable a word to be seen consistently as a sequence of letters from left to right. We also have a special focus on mastering those high-frequency abstract words such as if, and, the, no, from, between, while, and so on. These words make up about 60% of the words that we see on a typical page. And as I said earlier, dyslexics frequently stumble on these words while reading. They cause confusion and therefore disorientation because there's no meaning picture attached to them. And again, using processing clay, the dyslexic individual can create a model that switches on a picture for these words and eliminates the confusion they had been causing. And this creative investigative approach works across many areas of learning. So you can also use the same approach with school subjects. Here's an example where the process of photosynthesis has been clayed out. So once you've made this yourself in the clay, you know exactly what photosynthesis is, what all the components are. You can picture it, and you can walk into the exam room with your mental crib sheet of your mental image of what you made as being your model for photosynthesis and get all the answers right. Proton, here's an example where this model is exploring the way that proton and neutron have the same mass. So we've got a set of scales with a proton on one side and a neutron on the other, symbolizing that, and a little electron with a magnifying glass, which is much smaller. And also that protons and neutrons sit in the nucleus of the atom, as we'll see on the right there. Okay, so there are numerous applications across study skills as well. Here is Donovan, who Anne was 9, see, when you recorded this?
Yes, 9. Couldn't read, couldn't write, I couldn't do any of it.
And then in year 4, you did the Davis program. What did you do on your Davis program?
Sometimes I do it with like a tutor from Davis online on Zoom and stuff because at the time I think it was COVID.
Yes.
And we just did a bunch of words that I thought I didn't know how to spell, or even words that I didn't know how to spell. And basically we did that every night, and then I got better and better. We also wrote down the words, and I used to picture the clay models that I made. Like, I can still remember one now, over. So basically, I made this Tesla Cybertruck running over someone.
Do you remember the word over now?
Yeah, I remember it.
What's that, 2.5 years later?
2.5 years, yeah.
Fantastic. And when you went back to school, things were a bit different for you then. Did you find life easier?
Yeah, it was so much easier. I read this 257-page book, which is this one, and I thought it was good because it was my first book I've ever read like by myself without any help, and I just felt so proud of myself.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Donovan.
Thank you, see you later.
So Davis methods offer a whole range of one-to-one programs, and Davis facilitators can offer to help you or your child. Davis dyslexia facilitators can help master reading and writing, attention focus, and maths and numeracy. Davis autism approach facilitators and coaches offer programs addressing the difficulties experienced by both verbal and non-verbal autistic individuals, and to improve executive function for all individuals. Many of our facilitators will allow you to spread the cost of a program, making the lifelong benefits of a dyslexia and an attention mastery program, for example, available at a cost of £306 for 10 months. As a non-profit company, we try hard to make the program affordable across the globe. And in the UK and Ireland, we work closely with Gifts for Dyslexia, our sister organisation that I'm a trustee of, which is a registered charity, providing bursary assistance for those who can't afford a program, to ensure that as far as we're able and funds are available, cost is not a barrier to accessing a program. So if you would like to, we would invite you to take a little zap of that code. and reach out to us for an initial consultation. If you feel like having a conversation with Sue or one of our facilitators who's local to you, over a space of up to half an hour, in order to explore and examine your own learning profile, okay, or that of a loved one, and then the person that you're talking to can then make some recommendations, can give you a sense of whether Davis is likely to be able to be a benefit to you or your loved one, and if so, what would be the route? And then you can take the next steps if you feel that you would like to. So if you like, you can sort of zap that, and there's a little form that will open up. Alternatively, most of you, I think, have had a little paper sheet from us, which you can use in order to get a copy of what we call a Taste of Davis, which is our free online course. And on that, there's also a little tick box that you can tick if you would like to request a consultation, and then we will then sort that and get back to you. Okay. We'd also like to offer you a free resources page or pack that you can use to consolidate what you've learned at this lecture. It's kind of rather long, kind of looks like this. And you're also welcome to share this on with fellow parents, fellow educators, or your child's educators, or dyslexic individuals. Okay. We've got a number of recordings of our webinars up there, as well as some resource sheets, some guidance on supporting a child on how to engage with your school over your child's SEN support and all of that sort of thing. Okay. And again, that pack, if you want to go the QR code route, then you can get it by just taking a little picture of that. Is that working, by the way? It's big enough, is it? Yeah. Wonderful. Okay. We also have a WhatsApp news feed, which you're welcome to join. And the WhatsApp news feed, it's just a news feed. So most of the time, only administrators can post. And we'll just notify you from time to time if we've got a webinar coming up, as we do this Thursday. If we've got a workshop coming up that might be of interest to you, a parent course or that sort of thing. But every few weeks, we open it up for an hour so that everyone can post. And then it becomes like a little Q&A, which is quite exciting. So people will then post in with their questions. A number of our facilitators will usually hop on, and then you'll kind of get answers to questions. This is a rather crazy, spontaneous format, but everyone on it seems to quite enjoy it. So if you're interested in hopping onto the WhatsApp newsfeed, you can get there with this QR code. And while we're sort of handing out goodies, as it were, we had a major event in May, a 2-day series of webinars that we called Davis Neurodiversity Online. One of the presentations there by me was about dyslexia and masking, or the dyslexia that nobody sees. And if you would like to gain access to a recording of that webinar, free of charge, then feel free just to zap that code, and that will take you to a link on Vimeo where you can watch that webinar at leisure. And this Thursday, you can join us online if you're free for Dyslexia the Revolution, which is a webinar that we're going to be giving, looking at contrasting the old view of dyslexia with the new view, and looking at how throughout human history and civilization, there have been shifts in the way humanity has seen various things. If you go back to Galileo and how the universe is viewed, or the solar system, how the resistance that occurs when somebody comes along with a new idea until it's then ultimately accepted. And so we're looking at how the same thing now is happening with dyslexia and with learning differences in society, where that's heading, why it's so important, and what's going to happen for the benefit of dyslexic individuals from this process. And then once again, the initial consultation, if you feel you would like to reach out to us for one of those, feel free to either use the tickets on the piece of paper that you've got in front of you, or the QR code. Okay. And on that note, we've got about a quarter of an hour for any questions. And at this point, maybe Sue, if you'd like to join me, and also Anne, and Kitchen, so and Dave's facilitators. So we're going to come to the little team, and feel free to some questions right now. Yes. So the question is, if your child is doing the Davis methods and also phonic methods at school, is that going to confuse your child? First on that, but So you might also have a take. My sense would tend to be generally it won't. But what would be a problem would be if the child had been taught that the sounds of the letters were the names of the letters. So if a child has been taught that B is B, and the actual name of B has been disregarded and ignored, then that would cause a problem because the child's now going to have confusion around the identity of what they're seeing. And that shouldn't be happening because the national curriculum does mandate that letter names should be introduced, I think no later than year 2. So generally speaking, I would say it isn't a problem, but occasionally it can be, depending on the approach. Either of you had?
Well, it usually sorts out phonics because they've learned phonics using the alphabet song. And then when they get to LMNOP, that all seems to be one letter. And they don't realise that the letter names and the symbols are not one, but quite a few. And it separates them out so that they can actually see it for what it is. So for me and the children I've taught, it's been very, very useful to learn the letter names.
Yeah. There's a very simple way of dealing with this with a child. As long as a child hasn't been taught that the sound is the name, then a very simple way to help a child to sort it out is if I could say, okay, what am I doing? I'm scratching my head, right? What's my name? Richard. Yeah. And what am I doing? I'm going for a walk. What's my name? Richard. What am I doing? I'm sitting down and having a rest. What's my name? Richard. Yeah. So I'm Richard. I'm never not Richard. And I'm always Richard. That's my name. Yeah. But while I'm being Richard, there are all sorts of things that I can do. Yeah. As I just showed you, some of them. Yeah. It's the same with letters. A is always A. That's its name. It's never not A. Yeah. But it can do things like make the sound A in a word, or R, or A, and so on. And so that then becomes a way that you can help a child create order in their understanding of the difference between a name and a sound, and then it's usually okay. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
So, as a diagnostic assessor that you said you are, do you signpost parents in your recommendations to these techniques?
Yeah. So the question is whether, as a diagnostic assessor, I signpost parents to Davis techniques. I don't directly do so because it's kind of not sort of standard or normal practice to signpost to a specific method. But what I do is in my recommendations, I'm quite fulsome at scripting out kind of Davis-like techniques. And conversationally then, quite often if a family comes back to me and says, wants to discuss the report, and they'll say, well, the report was great and I love the recommendations, but where do we go from here? Then I'll advise the family how to engage with the school. And I'll sometimes also mention, you might have noticed on my website that I offer a series of interventions myself. And then, the family has the option to go that way too. Okay, any more questions? Yes.
Does the process of spelling and grammar improve just because reading improves?
That's a really interesting question. Do either of you want to go first on that?
Well, it does improve because of the it's tiny. It does improve because of the multisensory learning, but it also improves because within the multisensory learning, it is also taught. So grammar is taught, punctuation is taught, and it's practiced. So the child puts all of it together and the reading just miraculously improves. That's all I can say. And along with that, it's the self-esteem and the confidence that also grows because some children have suffered a lot of trauma, which Richard shared earlier. And that trauma of feeling different within the group and always being the negative difference in the group seems to lessen and the self-esteem grows.
If I come with it.
Yeah. Yes, just one other thought about grammar. Sometimes when you're working with children, if you create those pictures or help them create them for themselves, which is even more powerful, they can remember the different grammar categories. So you might have nouns. What on earth is a noun? And an adverb, a verb, an adjective, and heaven forbid, the fronted adverbial. Nobody knows what one of those is. But if you create a picture for it and say, right, this is your picture for a fronted adverbial 3 weeks ago, they can then, so somehow you help them to find on Google a picture for 3 weeks ago. And then that child is able to internalize the picture they found, and then they can remember. Young Donovan there on the screen a few minutes ago, he's now 12, he was 9. And one of the things that his mother has been doing with him, she's his best support person, is that she's been helping him create pictures to go with every one of his scientific definitions that he has to learn for biology. And she does this with what he calls the Richard method.
It's trying to work out what that is.
Oh yes, but I think it's all about something that you did at one of your lectures, which is creating a picture to go with each of these definitions: photosynthesis, osmosis, etc. And Mum relayed to me the other day that she'd been testing him for a science exam, and she'd asked 9 questions, and she said, "Right, you got all those right, because you connected the answers with the pictures." And this is a boy who was 2 years behind in maths and English when he was 9. And he's now caught up to the middle of the class, and he's finally moving into that top third of the class now. And she said, "And now for the 10th question." And he said, "Yeah, I know the answer." So she said, "How? I haven't even asked the question." So he said, "Well, I've used 9 of my pictures and just got 1 left. So I know the answer." And of course he was right. And he went on to get, I think, 82% in that exam. So this is where the gift part comes in. And this is snake oil. This is something that we do every single day, isn't it? So, Richard, we see.
Yeah. I suppose one further thing I would say about spelling. Spelling is kind of the other side of the coin of reading, because what we do in reading enables you to recognize the word next time you see it fluently. So fluency is being able to recognize the words. Spelling is then being able to reproduce the words that you've recognized with the letters in the right sequence. What we tend to find in a program is that reading, as Sue was saying, reading shoots up pretty much while you watch. So two things we're accustomed to seeing with reading in a 5-day Davis dyslexia program. The first is that at the beginning of the week, the individual is reading probably well below their age level and finding it hard. At the end of the week, the individual is reading at or close to age level and finding it easy. And it's those 2 elements of the improvement and the increase in ease that I think make Davis what it is. But spelling does tend to be a slower burn, because what you're left with is all the words that you don't know how to spell because you've been disorientating. Now, the younger you are when you do the Davis program, the easier and the quicker that comes right. So if you're a primary school client, typically you might be given 5 to 10 spellings a week to learn for a spelling test, a weekly spelling test. A lot of my primary clients, have that. And then it can become, okay, well, have a go at doing the words in the clay. Do 2 a night, and then the next night, if it's 10, do 2 a night. The next night, check your mental picture for the 2 you did the night before. See if you can picture the word and the letters that you made underneath it still. Go forwards and backwards through the letters, and then move on and do the next 2. Yeah, and I've then been finding my clients are suddenly going, wow, I'm acing those spelling tests, and I've shot up from getting 2 or 3 right to getting 9 or 10 right. And that's then the kind of normal pattern. But if you're working with someone who's already in secondary, they'll have a much bigger build-up of words that they don't know. So then there's a process. It's a little complex to explain here, but you can have a kind of a funnel process where you start writing something. You have to have some way you can go really easily to check if you don't know a word. So what I'll often do is have somebody write, if they don't have a computer as an access arrangement, write by hand, start writing a story, but with a computer open with a blank Word document with dictate enabled. Every time I don't know a word, I dictate it into the computer and then I copy it. And then I keep going. Again, I don't know that word, so I dictate and copy. Then at the end, I've then got a completely correct script that I just wrote and a list in the Word document of all the words I had to check. And then you can take those words and you can play them out, or you can go through if there's sometimes there's online platforms. There's a platform called Quizlet, which is very, very visual in the way that it works, very aligned to Davis. You can put those words into Quizlet, and then Quizlet will tell you, these are the words that you assimilated quickly and easily. These are the ones that are heavier going for you. So you might put 10 words into Quizlet, 2 of them come out as Quizlet didn't work for those words, and therefore then you get the clay out and you clay those 2 words. So there's various approaches, but spelling does require a bit more, persistence quite often. Okay.
So one more thing. In doing the alphabet, it's also looking at any gaps that they have, anything that triggers. And many, many times I've come across students who, it's J, it's just a normal J. But every time that they come across the J, there's an emotional trigger, or there's a trigger in not knowing the sound, JG, and they struggle with that. So each of the triggers or the gaps are addressed at the very beginning of the Davis programme, so that going forward, these don't hold them back. And in school, when they're just normally learning school at a class of 30, they're missed. It's not noticed that they have gaps. So the gaps get bigger and bigger as they go through the years.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you have a lot of experience of working with children who are dyslexic, have ADHD and autism? Does that change what you do?
Yes. Yeah. So the question is, working with individuals who have a combination of dyslexia and or ADHD and or autism. When there's autism in the mix, we will pretty much always work with the autism first, because it's kind of sitting at a deeper layer of the person's identity. And so once we've addressed the autism side of what's going on for the individual, then often after a fairly short period of time, they can then access a dyslexia program and do really well at it. Whereas if we'd gone with dyslexia first, the autism might have interfered and got in the way of that. Similar pattern with ADHD. Autism and ADHD, or ADHD, as it's sometimes now called, can be we can address them in a one singular approach. But if there's ADHD and dyslexia, we will tend to address the attention focus elements first and then work with the academic goals of the dyslexia afterwards.
Yeah. Well, here I go again, Richard. With the, I'm training to be an autism facilitator, and he's an autism facilitator, so she may say something after me. But for those with ADHD, what I find is that they either are very fast in their thinking or quite slow in their thinking, and they're usually picture thinkers, but because if they're fast, then they're not seeing those pictures. They're going through their mind very quickly. And when I work with them, I slow them down to see those pictures. Once they start seeing those pictures, that's when reading, comprehension, all sorts of other things just overnight develop. And it's like seeing 2 different people from starting and a short time into the programme. The comprehension and relating that to life skills. I have someone here that's just experienced that. Is amazing. Can I say?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Okay. We have a young man who's had no schooling for the last 5 years, who was given up basically, who is now very much with it, wants to learn. His manners are coming back. He's just two different people. As you said, he helped me out to the car the other day with my bags, and his mum nearly fainted because that's not him. So the program not only gives the academic skills, but it gives life skills and it gives social skills for them to actually access all different parts of life and just be themselves in whichever way they want to be, in the most gentlest manner, I must add.
Yes. Yes.
Just wondering about sort of timescales or like how it runs time-wise, like sessions and things like that.
Yeah, so timescales and how it runs time-wise. Most Davis programs are high impact in one-to-one intensives. So they don't feel like you're being dragged along by the, by your hair, as it were, because it's as Sue was saying, it's a very gentle, natural, and fun and interesting process. But certainly with individuals of secondary school age, a dyslexia program we're often doing over 5 days, 6 hours a day. So it's a 30-hour program that can start on Monday morning, and then you're reading at or close to age level and finding it easy by Friday evening. There's then a follow-up process that then takes a while after that, which you do at home with gentle support from us, and that then renders their gains permanent and greater still after the main program's over. Okay, but that's how we like to sort of deliver our expertise, and what we're aiming to do is by the end of the process that the person who came to us is a resilient, independent learner who no longer needs us. They will need support from family members who we also train, but they no longer need us. And that's our job, is to make ourselves redundant, really, as quickly as possible. Yeah, great job description.
Yes, and again, continuing on from that, the young man again who you saw, he's not my only client, but he seems to crop up a bit. He was asked he did a dyslexia program, and then he did something called the Concepts for Life, which we use with ADHD, autistic type profiles. And he was asked at the end, when we evaluated it all, how can your mum continue to support you as we continue with your education now? And he said, well, she can't. I don't need her anymore. I've finished with mum. She can go and rest now. So it definitely is, as Sue was saying, it helps them to just gain that independence. And we always see this uplifting confidence at the end of our programs. Yeah.
So the past 9 o'clock watershed, we'll maybe take one. We can probably take one more question before we're forcibly evacuated from the building. But yes. Yeah. Well, from eight upwards, it would be the norm. It would typically be that 30-hour block. But for primary school children, we might spread it out a little bit more. So we might. Sometimes primary school children can do the 5 hours as well, but for the 5 days, 6 hours a day. But it might be we do 4 hours a day. I've worked very successfully with 8-year-olds, 2 hours, then a lunch break, and then another 2 hours, and then we just spread it over 7 or 8 days. So we always start the process with what we call an individual program assessment, which is a one-to-one, but it's a face-to-face meeting with the facilitator, the child, and a family member. And then after that, that's our process of getting to know the individual and then making recommendations as to how he thinks is going to work best.
My programs, they tend to be 3-hour programs because I try to work with a school. Schools don't really want to have the children away from learning in the classroom, but are quite okay to have one morning or one afternoon. So I try and fit that in around the school. And I can tell you that they're usually very pleased because that child's skills go up very quickly.
Yeah, that can also work. So there's a degree of variety in how we can make it work, what the requirements are. Okay. Well, thank you all for being here this evening. It's been lovely to be with you. If you do feel like more from us, you're welcome to join us online on Thursday evening for our webinar if you would like to, and or through the WhatsApp group. We will let you know we're now building our next webinar series for July through to September, and we'll be notifying of those as we as we go along. So stay tuned and stay in touch. Maybe speak to some of you and maybe see some of you again soon. Okay. All the best.
Good evening.